He did not wake up one morning feeling powerful. Awareness never arrives like confidence. It arrives quietly, often disguised as discomfort. For a long time, he had believed that something was simply wrong with him. Not in a dramatic sense, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a subtle, persistent way that followed him into conversations, decisions, and silences. People interrupted him easily. Opinions brushed past him without resistance. His absence went unnoticed, and his presence rarely altered the atmosphere of a room. He told himself it was coincidence, personality differences, bad luck with people, anything except a pattern. Patterns are uncomfortable things. Once you see them, they refuse to be unseen. It began with small observations. He noticed how people spoke to him versus how they spoke to others. The difference was not volume or vocabulary, it was certainty. With others, words landed with respect. With him, they floated, waiting to be challenged, often dismissed without effort. He noticed how his politeness was mistaken for permission, how his patience invited delay, how his silence was interpreted as agreement. At first, these realizations did not empower him. They unsettled him. The mind resists responsibility when it threatens identity. And his identity had been built around being agreeable, understanding, adaptable. He had survived by reading rooms, adjusting himself, minimizing friction. That strategy had once protected him. Now it was costing him something far more valuable: self-respect. He began replaying moments from his past, not emotionally, but analytically. Scenes he had once labeled as normal suddenly felt distorted. The friend who only called when he needed something. The colleague who took credit without hesitation. The subtle jokes at his expense that everyone laughed at, including him. Why had he laughed? The answer was not courage or humility. It was fear. Fear of disruption. Fear of rejection. Fear of being seen as difficult. Psychology explains this quietly. The human brain prioritizes belonging over dignity. When conditioned to do so early, the need for acceptance becomes a reflex, not a choice. And reflexes operate below awareness. This is where his awakening truly began, not with anger, but with understanding. He realized that his mind had been trained, not deliberately, not maliciously, but effectively. Each time he ignored discomfort to keep peace, his brain logged it as survival. Each time he stayed silent to avoid tension, the pattern reinforced itself. Over time, silence became his default language, and people responded accordingly. The world does not respond to intentions. It responds to signals, and he had been signaling something he never meant to. The disturbing part was not that others behaved this way. It was that his own mind had been cooperating. He started noticing how quickly his thoughts rushed to explain others' behavior. Instead of questioning it, they didn't mean it. It's not worth it. Maybe I'm overthinking. These thoughts felt rational, mature, evolved. In reality, they were protective mechanisms designed to keep him from confrontation, not from harm. The subconscious does not care about respect. It cares about predictability. Predictability feels safe, even when it hurts. Once he understood this, something shifted internally. Not confidence, not aggression, but distance. He began observing his reactions instead of drowning in them. When someone dismissed him, he noticed the familiar urge to minimize himself and did nothing. When he felt the impulse to explain, justify, soften, he paused. That pause was new, and in that pause, power quietly entered the room. He realized something unsettling. People test boundaries unconsciously, not because they are cruel, but because the brain constantly seeks hierarchy and clarity. When boundaries are unclear, pressure increases. When resistance is absent, dominance fills the space naturally. This was not personal. It was psychological. The realization removed resentment from his awareness and replaced it with responsibility. He was not to blame for what had happened, but he was responsible for what continued. This distinction mattered. Blame weakens. Responsibility sharpens. He also began to notice how often he sought validation without realizing it. The slight change in tone when he wanted approval. The over-explanation. The subtle leaning forward, not physically, but emotionally. These were not flaws, they were strategies learned in environments where approval had been conditional. The mind remembers conditions long after the environment has changed. What disturbed him most was not how others reacted to him, but how predictably they did so once he recognized the pattern. Different faces, same outcomes, different rooms, same dynamics. That was when it became undeniable. This was not about people. This was about psychology. And psychology, once understood, stops feeling mystical and starts feeling mechanical. He did not confront anyone. Not yet. Awareness had taught him something crucial. Change introduced too early becomes performance. Real shifts begin internally, where no one is watching. So he observed. He observed how silence, when intentional, felt different from silence born of fear. He observed how stillness unsettled people more than compliance ever had. He observed how removing emotional urgency from his responses altered conversations subtly. But consistently, people did not suddenly respect him, but they began adjusting, and adjustment is the first signal of power recalibration. He understood now why confidence could not be fake for long. Because confidence is not posture, it is alignment. When internal boundaries solidify, external behavior follows naturally. For the first time, he was not trying to be respected. He was becoming less available for disrespect. This distinction changed everything. He began to understand that self-respect was never something you demanded. It was something your nervous system communicated long before words were spoken. People sensed it the way animals sense weakness or calm, not consciously, but instinctively. And for most of his life, his system had been signaling uncertainty. This realization did not flatter him. It sobered him. He noticed how often he entered conversations already preparing to retreat. His mind anticipated resistance before it even appeared. This anticipation shaped his tone, his posture, even the rhythm of his speech. He spoke quickly, as if afraid of taking too much time. He softened statements that required firmness. He smiled at moments that did not deserve warmth. These were not personality traits. They were adaptations. Adaptations formed in environments where emotional safety had been inconsistent, where approval had to be earned, where being easy reduced friction. Over time, the brain learned that shrinking felt safer than standing still. The cruel irony was that what once protected him now exposed him. The more he observed, the clearer it became. People did not consciously decide to disrespect him. They responded to the cues he unconsciously gave. His hesitation created space for interruption. His flexibility invited exploitation. His silence suggested tolerance. The mind, he learned, is constantly negotiating power subtly, invisibly. And power is not dominance. It is clarity. Those with internal clarity rarely explain themselves. Those without it often over-explain. He recognized himself in that pattern, and it unsettled him deeply. Moments from his past replayed with new meaning. Times when he felt drained after social interactions. Times when he agreed to things he resented later. Times when he left conversations feeling smaller, though nothing overtly harmful had occurred. These moments were not dramatic enough to protest, but they were cumulative enough to damage. Psychology calls this erosion. Not trauma but attrition. Self-respect rarely collapses in a single event. It fades through 1,000 micro-compromises, each one justified, each one forgotten, until one day the absence becomes louder than the presence ever was. He also noticed something else, something more disturbing. When he imagined asserting himself, his body reacted with tension. His chest tightened. His thoughts raced, not because asserting was dangerous but because his nervous system had learned to associate it with loss. Loss of connection, loss of approval, loss of safety. This was not weakness. It was conditioning. The brain does not forget emotional lessons easily, especially those learned early, when survival depends on attachment. The child learns quickly what behavior keeps peace, and that lesson often survives into adulthood long after it stops being necessary. Understanding this softened his self-judgment. He was not broken. He was trained. And training can be unlearned. This realization did not make him fearless, but it made him patient. He stopped forcing change and focused instead on awareness. He watched his impulses arise and fall without acting on them. The urge to please, the reflex to apologize, the need to be liked. He noticed how often these impulses had nothing to do with the present moment and everything to do with old emotional scripts running automatically. Awareness, he discovered, was disruptive. It interrupted patterns mid-execution. It created a gap between stimulus and response, and in that gap, choice became possible, slowly, almost imperceptibly. His internal posture shifted. He did not become louder. He became clearer. He did not confront. He withdrew unnecessary explanations. He did not demand space. He stopped shrinking to fill less. People reacted in subtle ways. Some leaned in, sensing a change they could not name. Others became uncomfortable, testing old dynamics that no longer worked as expected. A few grew distant not because he had changed dramatically, but because the unspoken agreement had expired. This was difficult. Not because he missed them, but because it confirmed something painful. Some connections survive only as long as one person remains smaller. Letting go of those dynamics felt like loss. Even when they were unhealthy, the mind resists endings, especially familiar ones. But awareness had already altered his perception. He could no longer unsee what he had seen. He understood now why awakening often feels isolating. When you stop participating in unconscious patterns, you no longer fit neatly into them. You move differently. You respond differently. And that difference is felt, even if it is never discussed. Yet beneath the discomfort, something steadier began to emerge, a quiet alignment. For the first time, his internal experience matched his external behavior. There was less performance, less calculation. He spoke when he had something to say. He paused when he did not. Silence no longer felt like erasure, it felt intentional. And intention, he learned, carries weight. He also began to recognize manipulation, not everywhere, not paranoiacally but clearly. Emotional pressure disguised as urgency. Guilt masked as concern. Familiar tactics that once worked effortlessly now revealed their shape the moment they appeared. This clarity did not make him cynical. It made him selective. He no longer felt compelled to react to everything. He understood that not every signal required a response, and not every emotion required action. This alone reduced his exhaustion dramatically. The mind, when no longer trapped in constant negotiation, becomes quieter. And in that quiet, self-respect begins to return, not as a declaration, but as a presence. He was still learning, still undoing years of reflexive behavior. But the foundation had shifted. Awareness had rewired the starting point. From here, action would no longer come from fear but from alignment. And alignment, once established, changes how the world responds without ever needing to announce itself. By the time this understanding settled within him, there was no dramatic transformation to announce, no sharp turn, no visible rebellion against the world. What changed was quieter, and because it was quiet, it was stronger. He could feel the old impulses rise at familiar moments, the urge to explain himself too quickly, the instinct to soften truths before they caused discomfort, the reflex to accept what did not sit right simply to preserve harmony. But now, those impulses no longer disguised themselves as logic. He recognized them for what they were, echoes of an earlier self, shaped by environments that no longer existed. Awareness had not erased these reactions. It had repositioned them. They were no longer commands. They were information. That distinction altered everything. For the first time, he understood that self-respect was not built through confrontation, nor through withdrawal. It emerged from alignment when the inner experience no longer contradicted the outer expression, when words were spoken without urgency, when silence was chosen, not endured, when presence did not depend on validation. This alignment brought an unfamiliar calm, not the calm of detachment, but the calm of internal agreement. His thoughts no longer raced ahead to anticipate rejection. His body no longer braced itself defensively in ordinary conversations. The tension he had once mistaken for awareness began to loosen. He noticed how differently time felt in social moments now. Pauses no longer frightened him. Gaps in conversation no longer demanded filling. He allowed moments to breathe, and in doing so, he realized how often he had mistaken stillness for weakness. Stillness, when grounded, carries weight. People sensed the shift even when they could not articulate it. Some responded with curiosity, adjusting their tone unconsciously. Others reacted with subtle resistance, attempting to restore familiar dynamics that no longer found purchase. A few drifted away, not out of conflict, but out of incompatibility. He did not chase them. That, too, was new. What surprised him most was not how others responded, but how little he felt compelled to interpret those responses. He had spent years trying to understand people, reading intentions, decoding moods, anticipating reactions. Now, that effort felt unnecessary, not because people had become simpler, but because his role in their reactions had become clearer. He was no longer responsible for maintaining equilibrium at the cost of himself. This realization did not make him rigid. It made him precise. He learned when to engage and when to step back, when to speak and when silence conveyed more truth. His boundaries were not announced. They were embodied. And because they were embodied, they did not invite negotiation. The mind, once trapped in constant self-monitoring, began to quiet. Thoughts slowed. Emotional spikes softened. Decisions no longer required internal debate. There was less justification, less rehearsal, less second-guessing. In this quieter mental space, something steady took root. Self-respect returned not as pride, but as presence. He understood now that respect is not something others grant freely, nor something one can forcefully extract. It arises naturally when behavior aligns with internal values, when actions are no longer driven by fear of loss or hunger for approval. This awareness did not isolate him from the world. It clarified his place within it. He still connected with people, still cared, still listened, but the compulsive need to be understood, liked, or validated had loosened its grip. He could allow misunderstanding without urgency, disapproval without collapse, distance without panic. That was the real shift, not dominance over others but sovereignty over himself. And with that sovereignty came readiness. He did not yet know how this awareness would translate into action. He did not rush to redefine himself or reshape his life overnight. He simply allowed the clarity to settle, trusting that behavior would follow naturally, as it always does when the mind stops contradicting itself. Part 2 ended here, not with resolution, but with grounding. The patterns were visible now. The fog had lifted, and from this point forward, nothing would operate unconsciously again. What came next would not be about discovering the problem. It would be about embodying the solution.